The final sequence did not announce itself with speed. It arrived with control, the kind that does not demand attention but commands it, as Evelyn's fingers moved with a confidence that no longer needed to prove anything. Each note placed with intention, each transition seamless, and the broken keys that had once threatened to expose weakness now seemed irrelevant, almost forgotten, because she had rewritten the instrument's limitations into her own language, a language the room was beginning to understand in silence. And somewhere deep within the melody, there was a shift, subtle at first, then unmistakable, a passage that carried emotion far beyond technique, something reflective, almost nostalgic, as if the music itself was remembering a time when stages were brighter, audiences louder, and her name perhaps spoken with recognition instead of indifference, though she never looked up, never acknowledged the room that had now surrendered completely to her presence, because this was not for them anymore. This was something internal, something that had been waiting patiently beneath years of quiet routine and unnoticed existence. And as the composition unfolded, the older gentleman in the front row leaned forward even more, his eyes narrowing with growing certainty, his fingers tightening around the edge of his seat, as if trying to hold on to a realization forming too quickly, while a woman beside him whispered again, this time more urgently, "Do you hear that phrasing? That is not random." But again, no one responded, because the air itself felt too heavy to interrupt, and Victor Langston, who had once stood with casual authority, now shifted his weight slightly, his arms no longer crossed, his posture no longer relaxed, his gaze fixed on Evelyn with something unfamiliar, not annoyance, not amusement, but confusion, because this outcome had never been part of his plan, and men like him were not accustomed to losing control of a narrative they had carefully constructed. And yet here he was, watching as the room that had once mirrored his confidence now reflected something entirely different, respect, not given freely, but earned in real time, note by note. And then came the final ascent, a sequence that built gradually, drawing the melody upward with a quiet intensity that made the silence in the room feel almost electric, as if every person present understood instinctively that they were approaching a moment that could not be undone. And when Evelyn reached the final chord, she did not strike it forcefully. She allowed it to settle, her fingers pressing just enough to let the sound resonate fully, filling the vast ballroom with a tone that was neither perfect nor flawed, but undeniably complete. And then she lifted her hands, slowly, deliberately, letting the last vibration fade into nothing. And in that moment, no one moved, no one spoke, no one even seemed to breathe, because the absence of sound carried more weight than applause ever could. The room had gone completely silent, not out of uncertainty, but out of recognition, the kind that arrives when something genuine cuts through expectation. And Evelyn remained seated for a brief second. Longer, her expression unchanged, her posture still composed, as if what had just happened required no acknowledgement, as if she had simply done what was necessary and nothing more. And when she finally stood, stepping away from the piano with the same quiet presence she had arrived with, it was Victor who reacted first, though not with words, because there were none that could restore what had just been lost, only a slight movement, a hesitation, a realization settling in too late, that the moment he had intended as a joke had revealed something far greater than he had anticipated, and in doing so, it had shifted the entire room beyond his control, leaving behind a silence that spoke louder than any applause ever could. For a long moment after she stepped away, the silence did not break. It deepened, stretching across the ballroom like a held breath no one dared release, until a single sound cut through it, not loud, not dramatic, but clear, the deliberate clap of the older gentleman in the front row, his hands meeting once, then again, steady and unapologetic, and slowly, almost reluctantly at first, others followed. The applause building not from politeness, but from something far more genuine, recognition, respect, and a quiet acknowledgement that what they had just witnessed could not be dismissed as coincidence or novelty. It spread through the room like a wave, rising in volume until it filled the high ceilings and echoed against the marble floors. And yet Evelyn did not turn back. She did not bow. She did not pause to receive it. She simply continued walking toward the edge of the stage, as if the applause belonged to a different moment, a different life, and not to her. But before she could step down, a voice called out, firm and unmistakable, Evelyn Carter. And the name seemed to land differently in the room, carrying weight that had not been there before. She stopped, not abruptly, but just enough to acknowledge it, and when she turned, her expression remained calm, though her eyes met the older gentleman who had now risen to his feet, his gaze fixed on her with a mixture of disbelief and certainty. "It has been years," he said, his voice carrying easily across the quieting crowd, "but I would recognize that phrasing anywhere." A murmur rippled through the audience as heads turned, searching for context, for meaning, and Victor Langston felt it immediately. The shift, the attention no longer centered on him or his event, but on something he had not anticipated, something he could not control, and the gentleman continued, stepping slightly forward. "You performed at Carnegie Hall, did you not, nearly a decade ago?" The question hung in the air, but it did not feel like a question. It felt like confirmation, and for the first time, Evelyn's composure showed the faintest crack, not of fear, but of acknowledgement, a past she had not intended to bring into this room. Not tonight, not like this. But the silence demanded truth, and she gave it simply. "Yes," she said, her voice soft but clear, and the effect was immediate. The murmurs grew louder. Names were whispered, fragments of memory piecing together among those who had once followed the world of classical music, and Victor's expression shifted again, the confusion now giving way to something sharper, realization, the kind that arrives too late to prevent consequence, because he understood now that this had not been a harmless moment, not an insignificant act. He had not placed an amateur on that stage. He had exposed himself, his assumptions, his arrogance, and the room could see it, feel it, measure it against the quiet dignity of the woman he had tried to turn into a joke. And the gentleman spoke once more, his tone no longer questioning but certain. "You were one of the finest pianists of your generation." And this time, the statement did not fade into silence. It settled into the room, heavy and undeniable, as if rewriting everything that had come before it. And Evelyn held his gaze for a brief second, then gave a small, almost imperceptible nod, not in pride, not in denial, but in acceptance of what was. And then she stepped down from the stage, leaving behind not just the piano, but the illusion that she had ever been ordinary. And as she moved through the crowd, the space around her shifted. People who had once overlooked her now stepped aside. Instinctively, their expressions changed, their eyes following her with a respect they had not offered before, and Victor Langston remained where he stood, his carefully constructed composure now fragile, because there was no statement he could make, no gesture he could perform that would restore the balance he had lost. The room had already decided, and in that quiet shift, in that unspoken judgment, his authority felt smaller, diminished not by force, but by truth, the kind that does not need to be announced to be understood. The applause continued long after Evelyn had stepped off the stage, but it no longer felt like a performance reaction. It felt like a correction, as if the room itself was trying to undo the mistake it had made just minutes earlier. And yet she did not slow down, her pace steady, her expression unchanged, moving through the crowd with the same quiet presence she had always carried, though now every pair of eyes followed her, not with curiosity, but with recognition, and that difference hung in the air heavier than the music that had come before it, because respect, once awakened, cannot be ignored. And near the edge of the ballroom, just before she could disappear, beyond the velvet curtains, Victor Langston finally moved, his steps no longer measured for control, but driven by something closer to urgency, a need to reclaim a moment that had slipped beyond his grasp. "Miss Carter," he called out, his voice firm, but lacking the effortless authority it had carried earlier, and the name echoed just enough to draw attention again. Though this time not in his favor, Evelyn paused, turning slowly, her gaze meeting his without hesitation, without hostility, simply present, and for a brief second, the contrast between them felt reversed, not in status, but in composure, because Victor, who had once commanded the room, now seemed to stand within it, not above it. "I was not aware of your background," he began, choosing his words carefully, as if precision could restore balance. "Had I known, the situation would have been handled differently." The statement hovered between apology and justification, but the room did not respond because everyone understood what it truly meant. And Evelyn listened without interruption, her posture calm, her hands still at her sides. And when he finished, she tilted her head slightly, considering, not his words, but the intention behind them. "You handled it exactly as you intended," she replied, her voice even, not raised, yet carrying clearly through the quiet. And the simplicity of the statement landed harder than any accusation could have, because it left no space for reinterpretation, no room for escape. And Victor's expression tightened, not in anger, but in realization, because she had not challenged him, she had revealed him. And in that moment, the power he had relied on, the assumption that he could define others based on appearance, felt suddenly fragile, exposed under the weight of truth. And around them, the guests remained still, not out of discomfort, but out of awareness, as if they were witnessing something more important than the performance itself, something that extended beyond music into something deeper, something about judgment, about perception, about the quiet consequences of underestimating someone who never needed to prove anything in the first place. And Evelyn held his gaze for 1 second longer, just enough to let the meaning settle. Then she gave a small nod, not of agreement, not of forgiveness, but of closure, and turned away, continuing toward the exit without waiting for a response, because none was needed. The moment had already spoken for itself, and as she disappeared behind the curtain, the room did not return to what it had been before. The conversations that slowly resumed carried a different tone, softer, more reflective, as if each person present had been forced to reconsider something unspoken within themselves. And Victor Langston remained standing where he was, surrounded by a room he still technically hosted, yet no longer controlled, because authority, once questioned in silence, does not return the same. And for the first time that evening, he did not look at the stage, or the guests, or even the broken piano that had started it all. He looked down, just briefly, as if acknowledging something he had not planned to learn. And in that quiet moment, without announcement, without spectacle, the balance of the room had shifted completely, not through force, but through a simple truth revealed at exactly the right time, and there was nothing left to say. The ballroom never fully returned to its earlier rhythm, even as the music resumed from a backup system, and servers began moving again with trays balanced carefully through the crowd, because something had settled beneath the surface, something that could not be undone by polished smiles or carefully timed conversations. And in small clusters across the room, people spoke in lower voices, glancing occasionally toward the stage where the broken piano still sat under the spotlight, no longer a symbol of prestige, but a quiet reminder of how quickly perception could shift. And near the front row, the older gentleman who had first recognized Evelyn remained standing for a moment longer than necessary, his eyes fixed on the empty space she had left behind, as if replaying every note in his mind, measuring not just the performance, but the circumstances that had surrounded it. And beside him, a woman in a dark blue dress leaned closer, her voice hushed. "Why would someone like her be working here?" she asked, not out of judgment, but genuine confusion, and the gentleman exhaled slowly before answering. "Sometimes the world does not reward talent the way it should," his tone carrying a quiet weight that suggested experience, not speculation. And across the room, Victor Langston finally moved again, though his steps lacked the certainty they once held. As he approached a small group of investors who had been central to the evening's event, their expressions polite, but no longer impressed in the same way, because the narrative he had intended to control had been interrupted. And moments like that lingered, especially among those who understood the value of perception. A minor disruption, Victor began, attempting to reframe what had occurred, his voice steady, though slightly measured, unexpected, but ultimately resolved. And the words sounded appropriate, professional, but they did not carry the same authority they once would have, because the room had already formed its own understanding. And one of the investors, a man known for his directness, gave a slight nod before responding. "Resolved, perhaps," he said, his tone neutral, but revealing. And that single word lingered longer than any explanation Victor could offer, because it did not challenge him directly. It simply acknowledged what had been seen. And there was no argument against observation. And for a brief moment, Victor had no response, not because he lacked language, but because he understood that anything he said would only reinforce the truth already present. And so he offered a polite smile instead, one that did not quite reach his eyes, before excusing himself, stepping away from the conversation with a composure that was carefully maintained, but no longer natural. And as he moved toward the edge of the room, his gaze drifted once more toward the stage, toward the piano that had once been a centerpiece of pride, now standing quietly as if it, too, had witnessed something it could not forget. And in the corridor beyond the ballroom, the atmosphere was different, quieter, free from the weight of expectation, and Evelyn Carter walked alone, her footsteps soft against the carpeted floor, her expression unchanged, though her eyes carried a depth that had not been visible before, not because it had not existed, but because no one had taken the time to look. And as she reached the service exit, she paused briefly, her hand resting lightly on the door handle, not out of hesitation, but reflection, a moment that belonged only to her, separate from the room she had just left behind. And then, without ceremony, she stepped outside into the cool evening air, the city lights stretching beyond the building in quiet contrast to the intensity she had just walked through. And inside, the event continued, conversations resumed, plans moved forward, but something had changed in a way that could not be reversed, not loudly, not dramatically, but unmistakably. Because once a room has witnessed truth in its purest form, it carries it, whether it chooses to acknowledge it or not. And that night, in ways both seen and unseen, every person present left with more than they had arrived with, though few would ever say it out loud. The night air outside carried a calm that the ballroom could not contain, cool and steady, brushing lightly against Evelyn's face as she stepped onto the quiet sidewalk, the distant hum of traffic replacing the echo of applause. And for the first time since she had touched the piano, there was no audience, no expectation, only the simple rhythm of the city moving forward without pause. And she stood there for a moment, her gaze drifting across the streetlights stretching in long lines down the avenue, her posture relaxed but grounded, as if she had returned to a space where nothing needed to be proven. And behind her, through the tall glass windows of Langston Heritage Hall, the event continued in softened tones, silhouettes moving, conversations resuming. But even from a distance, it felt different, as though the building itself carried the weight of what had just unfolded. And inside, Victor Langston stood near the edge of the ballroom once more, though now his attention was no longer on the guests or the stage, but on the reflection of the glass doors where Evelyn had exited, his image staring back at him, with a stillness he was not accustomed to. Because for a man who built his reputation on precision and control, there was something deeply unsettling about a moment he could not rewrite. And as he remained there, one of the senior coordinators approached cautiously, her voice measured. "Sir, should we prepare a statement regarding the performance?" she asked, not out of urgency, but awareness that the evening had shifted in ways that extended beyond the room. And Victor did not answer. Immediately, his gaze still fixed forward, his mind replaying not just the music, but the simplicity of Evelyn's response, the way she had not raised her voice, had not argued, had not even needed to defend herself, and yet had left an impression that no explanation could erase. "No," he said finally, his tone quieter than before. "There is nothing to clarify." And the coordinator nodded, though her expression suggested she understood more than his words conveyed, because sometimes silence speaks more clearly than statements ever could. And across the ballroom, conversations continued to circle back to the same moment, guests recalling the shift, the realization, the instant when expectation had been replaced by truth. And among them, the older gentleman spoke with quiet certainty to those gathered near him, recounting Evelyn's past with a respect that elevated her presence far beyond the role she had been given that night. And each retelling carried a subtle correction, a reminder that what had been dismissed as insignificant had in fact been extraordinary. And outside, Evelyn began to walk, her pace unhurried, her steps steady as she moved down the sidewalk, passing storefronts already dimmed for the evening, her reflection appearing briefly in each window before fading again. And there was no urgency in her movement, no sense of escape or triumph, only a quiet continuation. as if the night had been one moment among many, not the defining one, and yet something had shifted, not in her, but around her, because recognition, once revealed, changes the way the world responds, even when she does not seek it. And as she reached the corner, a car slowed briefly at the light, the driver glancing in her direction without knowing why, as if something about her presence carried a weight that could not be easily explained. And she continued on, turning down a quieter street where the city lights softened, the noise faded, and the world returned to its ordinary rhythm. But inside Langston Heritage Hall, ordinary no longer felt the same, because the memory of that moment lingered in every conversation, every glance, every unspoken acknowledgement that something real had cut through the surface, and Victor Langston remained still just a little longer before finally turning away from the glass, his posture straightening out of habit, but his expression carrying a depth that had not been there before, not defeat, but awareness, the kind that does not disappear once it arrives. And though the event would end, the guests would leave, and the lights would dim, the lesson would remain, quiet and persistent, long after the music had faded, because some moments do not need to be repeated to be remembered. They simply exist, and in existing, they change everything. By the time the event began to wind down, the conversations had shifted from business deals and polite introductions to something quieter, more reflective, as small groups lingered near the exits, their voices lowered, their expressions thoughtful, because the evening had delivered something none of them had expected, something that could not be summarized in a brochure or measured in numbers. And as the final guests prepared to leave Langston Heritage Hall, the older gentleman who had first spoken Evelyn's name found himself standing once more near the stage, his eyes resting on the piano that now sat in stillness, its imperfections unchanged, yet somehow no longer defining. And he reached out briefly, running his fingers lightly across the edge of the instrument, not to play, but to acknowledge, as if recognizing that it had been part of something far greater than itself. And behind him, a younger man approached, his tone respectful. "Sir, do you really believe she will perform again?" he asked, his curiosity genuine, and the gentleman paused before answering, his gaze steady. "People like her never stop performing," he said quietly. "They simply choose when the world is ready to listen." And the words lingered as the last of the lights dimmed slightly, signaling the end of the evening. And across the room, Victor Langston stood near the exit, greeting departing guests with practiced composure, though his movements were more measured now, his smile more restrained, as if each interaction carried an awareness he had not possessed before. And while no one confronted him directly, the subtle shifts were unmistakable, a slight hesitation in tone, a longer pause in eye contact, a quiet recalibration of respect that no longer flowed solely in his direction. And as the final guests stepped out into the night, the ballroom gradually emptied, leaving behind only the soft echo of footsteps and the faint hum of the building settling into silence. And Victor remained for a moment longer, alone in the space he had once controlled so completely, his gaze once again drifting toward the stage, where the piano sat beneath a single remaining light. And for the first time, he did not see it as an object of prestige or failure, but as a reminder, a fixed point in time that would not change no matter how much he might wish to reinterpret it. And slowly, he walked toward it, his steps quieter now, less certain, and when he reached the instrument, he paused, his hand hovering above the keys, not touching them, as if understanding that whatever had been revealed there was not something he could replicate or undo. And after a brief moment, he lowered his hand, stepping back, because some lessons are not meant to be revisited, only remembered. And outside, the city had fully embraced the night, the streets lit by rows of lamps casting long shadows across the pavement. And Evelyn Carter continued her walk, her pace unchanged, her path leading her through familiar streets where no one recognized her, where no one paused or stared. And in that anonymity, there was a quiet comfort, a return to something simple and steady. And as she reached her small apartment building, she paused briefly at the entrance, glancing up at the dimly lit windows above, her reflection faint in the glass door before she stepped inside. The hallway quiet, the air still, and when she entered her apartment, the space greeted her with the same quiet presence it always had, a modest room, neatly arranged, a a small, upright piano positioned near the window, its surface worn but cared for, and for a moment, she stood there, her gaze resting on it, not with longing, but with familiarity, and as she moved closer, her fingers brushed lightly against the keys, producing a soft, imperfect chord that echoed gently in the small space, and she smiled, just slightly, because this was where the music had never needed an audience, where it had existed simply because it could, and as she sat down, her hands settling into place, the first notes she played were not for recognition, not for validation, but for herself, steady and unhurried, filling the room with a quiet truth that required nothing from the world beyond it. And in that moment, far from the ballroom and its shifting perceptions, the balance she carried remained exactly as it had always been, unchanged by applause, untouched by judgment, grounded in something far deeper than either. The night settled into stillness, not just in the quiet streets outside Evelyn's apartment, but in the minds of those who had witnessed what they could not quite explain, because some moments do not end when the lights go out. They linger, reshaping understanding long after the sound has faded, and inside Langston Heritage Hall, long after the final guest had left and the staff had begun their routine of clearing tables and dimming lights, Victor Langston stood alone once more, the vast ballroom now empty, the marble floors reflecting only the soft glow of overhead fixtures, and in that silence, the absence of voices made everything clearer, not louder, but sharper, as if the truth of the evening had been waiting for this exact moment to settle without distraction. And he walked slowly across the room, not with purpose, but with awareness, his footsteps echoing faintly as he approached the stage again, stopping a few feet from the piano, the same instrument that had once symbolized prestige, now standing as a quiet witness to something far beyond its design. And for a moment, he simply looked at it, not as an object, but as a mirror, reflecting a version of himself he had not intended to see, a man who had measured worth too quickly, who had mistaken silence for insignificance, who had believed that control was the same as understanding. And as he stood there, the memory replayed not as a performance, but as a realization. Evelyn's calm presence, her steady hands, her refusal to react the way he expected, and most of all, her words, simple, precise, undeniable. And in that recollection, something shifted within him, not dramatically, not in a way that could be announced or displayed, but quietly, like a correction taking place beneath the surface and across the city, in a small apartment filled with soft light and the gentle echo of piano notes. Evelyn Carter played without an audience, her movements relaxed, her expression calm. The music flowing not for recognition, but because it belonged to her, because it always had. And in that space, there was no contrast, no judgment, no expectation, only the simple truth of something done with care and intention. And as the final notes of her quiet melody settled into the stillness of the room, she lifted her hands, letting the sound fade naturally, not holding on to it, not extending it, just allowing it to exist and then pass. And she sat there for a moment, not reflecting on the evening, not replaying the applause or the silence, because none of it had changed who she was. It had only revealed it to others, and that distinction mattered more than any recognition could. And back in the empty hall, Victor turned away from the stage, his posture straighter, but his expression different, not diminished, but aware, as if he understood now that respect could not be assigned based on appearance, that presence could not be measured by volume, and that sometimes the most powerful individuals are the ones who do not announce themselves at all. And as he walked toward the exit, the lights behind him dimmed one by one, the space returning to its quiet, neutral state. But something remained, not visible, not tangible, yet undeniable, a shift that would influence how he saw the next person who entered that room, how he listened, how he judged, or perhaps how he chose not to. And outside, the city continued as it always did, unaware of the lesson that had taken place within those walls, unaware that a single moment had quietly challenged assumptions that had gone unquestioned for years. And in that contrast, between the ordinary flow of the world and the quiet transformation within it, there was a truth that did not need to be spoken aloud, because it had already been demonstrated, not through force, not through argument, but through a simple act carried out with precision and dignity. And that night, in different places, under different lights, two people carried forward the same moment in entirely different ways. One as a reminder of who she had always been, the other as a lesson in who he had yet to become, and in that balance, something real had been restored, not loudly, not dramatically, but completely, because dignity does not demand recognition. It reveals itself when the moment calls for it, and once revealed, it cannot be ignored.